Today's case involves a $6,000 shower curtain and a $2 million birthday party. Coming right up. In today's episode, we're talking about Tyco. Now, this is a case that happened 20 years ago, and the reason why we're talking about it today is because, again, I want you to be able to talk about these cases intelligently, whether at work or at a job interview. Number two, we learn from these cases. So by examining, what errors or what mistakes were done in the past, we're able to not fall in them again in the future. The third reason is it makes you a better investor by knowing what kind of accounting issues and what kind of fraud can take place. You're able to spot them if you see them in the future. Tyco was founded in 1960 by Arthur Rosenberg, who started the company as a research and development company that was basically providing the service to the US military. So the main, or maybe the only customer at the time, was the US military, and Tyco was making or performing a research and development in the area of semiconductors and selling this research to the government. But then later on, Tyco branched into making its own product, and primarily it was security systems, fire alarms, and protective equipment in general. They filed for IPO in 1964 under the ticker symbol TYC. Now, the company was growing very rapidly between 1970 and in 1980s. They were growing mainly by making acquisitions. So they were acquiring smaller companies. They made between 16 and 18 acquisitions in the 2 decades. And the stock was growing pretty nicely. They were growing upward and to the right, and they reached at some point $100 a share. Now, in the early 1990s, there was a star who was rising at Tyco, and that is Dennis Kozlowski. Now, Dennis Kozlowski grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in New Jersey. He grew up in an apartment building in Newark, middle-class family. He went to school and became an accountant, funny enough, and he joined Tyco as a junior accountant. And imagine, he worked his way up from an accountant all the way to a CEO. It took him a couple of decades, but it's not something that anyone can do. It's definitely an achievement. So basically, he grew from working in the accounting department to becoming the head of the company in a couple of decades. He was a very aggressive guy. So, he was, they called him Deal a Day Dennis because he was acquiring companies, in the 90s. In 1 decade, he made about 3,000 acquisitions, the most notable of which is ADT, which is the famous home security company. And under his leadership, Tyco joined the S&P 500, which for those of you who don't know, the S&P 500 is a stock market index that includes the biggest 500 companies by market cap or by valuation. So Dennis Kozlowski was the rising star. He was leading the company. He was a pretty rich guy. He was making about $100 million a year in bonuses. So he was actually, Wall Street was looking at him as Gordon Gekko of real life. So for those of you who watch Wall Street, they likened Dennis Kozlowski to Gordon Gekko. Was the famous phrase, greed is good.
Greed, for lack of a better word, is good.
So he definitely embodied that persona of Wall Street, and he was making tons of money. Now, things were going fine in the 90s. He was using the company's funds for his own benefit, but we'll get to that in the early 2000s when that came to light. Basically, what Dennis Kozlowski was doing was he's using the company checking account to fund his extravagant lifestyle. So him and his wife, for example, who owned an apartment in New York City, they hired an internal decorator, and they bought a shower curtain for $6,000. There are pictures online for that shower curtain. Honestly, I think it looks ugly, but what do I know? I'm just an accountant. But anyway, and for his wife's 40th birthday party, he threw a huge party in Italy that cost $2 million. And again, he funded that through the company. And so in the early 2000s, things were going well. He was doing all that. Nobody knew anything about it. 2001, Enron happens. And with the fall of Enron, suddenly the US government prosecutors are in the hunt are out for blood. They're looking to see who's flashy, who has an extravagant lifestyle amongst the top CEOs. And definitely Dennis Kozlowski stood out as a guy who was living lavishly. And also around the same time in 2002, another catalyst is that the company Tyco suddenly had a giant loss. So imagine Tyco all these years has been making a profit for its shareholders and big profits, and then suddenly in 2002 they reported a huge loss related to write-offs and impairments to goodwill and previously acquired assets. So that big catalyst of the loss combined with the fall of Enron just prompted the U.S. prosecution to look into him. And when they looked into him, they found that he owed sales tax. So one of the things that Dennis Kozlowski was doing, he was funding his love for the artwork. He was buying artwork using the company's funds. But one of the things that happened is that when he was buying this artwork, he didn't pay sales tax on some of these things. And so when they looked into the purchases, they found that he paid no sales tax. And that was basically the indictment. So the U.S. prosecutors were able to indict Dennis Kozlowski on a small minor yet criminal offense, which is tax evasion. So they catch Kozlowski on tax evasion, but that's a small offense compared to what they are going to find later on. So that was just the beginning of the fall of Dennis Kozlowski. Basically, now they indicted him on tax evasion, sales tax, but then they'll find more as they peel back the onion. Once they start looking into Dennis Kozlowski, they found that much of his bonuses that he was receiving throughout the 90s were unauthorized by the board of directors. Now, this is, you can say that this is a corporate governance problem, like this is an internal problem of the company, but at the same time, taking unauthorized bonuses would constitute stealing from the shareholders. And he was doing all this with the help of this guy. Let's put his picture up here. Mark Schwartz, who was a CFO. He was basically helping him hide his tracks. And he will come in later on in the story as someone who gets indicted by the U.S. prosecutors. Now, Dennis Kozlowski goes on trial, and throughout the trial, he maintains his innocence. He says that he did nothing wrong. If you look at an interview that he did in 2016, he basically still maintains his innocence from all of these charges. Let's take a listen.
Did you have a kind of queasy feeling that this might be the beginning of something much, much graver?
Well, I had the feeling that I did nothing wrong, and that I have to fight this, and doing what I needed to do was going to take away my ability to run a company.
The other thing to note here is that Dennis Kozlowski has always seen himself as someone who deserves these giant bonuses. In the same interview in 2016 that he gave to the Financial Times, he describes how he feels about the pressures that he was under and how he deserves these bonuses. Take a listen.
I think the most stressful thing was the acquisitions. And some of the acquisitions, you can make or break the company. I was considering leaving Tyco, and my mind was made up. In fact, I had a couple of other opportunities where I felt I was at Tyco long enough, and I sought some outrageous terms, from the compensation committee to stay.
So the trial of Dennis Kozlowski begins in 2004, and oddly enough, his trial gets declared as a mistrial for a very odd reason. Basically, one of the jurors, a woman, as she exited the courtroom and went to the exit door, she looked toward the defense table and signaled to them the OK sign. She later denied it, but the whole thing came out, and she received some threats from strangers, and the judge had to declare it a mistrial, and they had to go through a second trial in 2005, in which then Dennis Kozlowski was found guilty, and that's, you can imagine a rich guy sitting in the courtroom, a guy who makes $100 million a year, he's looked at as someone who's demonized, as the villain, and so, in a way it was a bit unfair, but at the same time, he did steal from shareholders. So he was sentenced to 8 years in jail and ordered to pay together, him and Mark Schwartz, who was the CFO, together they were ordered to pay $134 million in fines. And Dennis Kozlowski received an 8-year jail sentence with a maximum of 25 years. Mark Schwartz received the same sentencing. So basically he got 8 years, minimum 8 years. It can be up to 25 years. We'll see later that he only served 6.5 years out of the 8 years because he got out with good behavior. But basically, he got the 8-year sentence. While Dennis Kozlowski is in jail, he gets a job during his jail time in the laundry room. So basically, now a guy who was making $100 million a year is making $1 a day working the laundry in jail. And you can take a listen during this interview in 2016 with the Financial Times how Dennis Kozlowski describes that job. Take a listen.
What I needed to do was to stay busy, in some way. And by having the laundry job, I was able to sit in the laundry room and have a chair, which is a rare commodity in prison. It's the one I was in.
So now Dennis Kozlowski is in jail. He's serving his minimum 8-year jail term. Fast forward 5.5 years, he gets in front of a parole board and he gets denied. Fast forward a year later, now it's 6.5 years. He sits in front of the parole board and he gets approved. Basically, he describes it in an interview that he gave in 2016 as him telling the parole board what they needed to hear, rather than saying that he feels remorse, because he actually feels the remorse. He actually said that just to get out of jail, and you can take a listen here.
Desperate for freedom, he told the parole board simple greed led to his downfall.
It's like a terrorist sitting there with a gun to your head and saying, unless you tell us what we need to hear or what we want to hear, you're not going to get parole.
Now, Dennis Kozlowski gets out of jail 6.5 years later. He's lost much of his net worth because he had to pay tremendous fines. And obviously his reputation took a huge hit. He's working now with an advisory firm. He's providing advisory to big companies. But basically he's back to the public life. As for Tyco itself, the company, they continued to grow after this scandal. The scandal itself affected the company because the company had to pay big amounts of in settlements to shareholders who sued the company in a class action lawsuit, basically because of the losses of these shareholders had when the stock took a dip because of the scandal. But the company itself continued to grow after that, and it was acquired in 2016 by Johnson Controls. And now the surviving entity is Johnson Controls. Well, that's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed watching and learning about Tyco, and I hope that you learned and now can speak about the case and about the accounting scandal by the CEO and the CFO of Tyco. If you enjoy learning as much as I do, you will like SKILLSHARE. So I wanted to recommend SKILLSHARE.com, which is a website that I joined. I'm a teacher and a student in the website, so I teach classes. I have actually 3 active classes right now, one on KPIs, one on accounting, and one on retirement. And I also enjoy the website as a student where I learn new skills. I actually learn how to take films or videotape using the website. And so I highly recommend SKILLSHARE, and they are running a promotion now for 2 months for free, 60 days free trial. Basically a credit card is required, but as long as you cancel your membership before the 60 days, you are scot-free, no obligation. So just put a reminder on your phone that before the 60 days, you make a decision whether you want to continue or you want to stop the membership. There's no obligation there. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you in the next video.